Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this issue briefing on innovation, skills, and the future of jobs. Can I just ask if we can possibly close the doors so we have a little bit less noise?
Yeah, it's noisy.
Okay, let me introduce our panel, and then we can get started for a very exciting discussion. To my immediate left is Minister Ahmad bin Abdullah Humaid Belhoul Falasi, Minister of State for Higher Education and Advanced Skills of the United Arab Emirates. Welcome, and thank you so much for hosting us in your country. At the very end of the panel, we have Sarah Kirby, Group Head, Organizational Design and Human Resource Strategy from the Zurich Insurance Group in Switzerland. Welcome, Sarah.
It's okay.
Next to her, we have Laura Tyson, Distinguished Professor of the Graduate School, Haas School of Business, University of California, Berkeley. Welcome, Laura. And then finally, we have Minister Maxim Oreshkin, Minister of Economic Development of the Russian Federation. Welcome. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. As you must have seen in the description of this session, there's always been debate about what the future of jobs may look like. Are we talking about a robot apocalypse? Are we talking about a future in which there are many more jobs and technology allows all of us to fulfill our potential in a different way? Are we talking about new business models, or are we talking about a situation where machines take over all the tasks and skills that we currently deploy as people? One way in which we have been trying to understand the answers to that question is through the World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs report, which surveys CEOs, CTOs, chief strategy officers, and most importantly, heads of HR, the people that are at the front lines of making some of these decisions, making the technology investments as well as the people investments. And we've asked them exactly this question. And what we found is that by and large, the future of jobs looks overwhelmingly positive, with many more jobs expected to be created than lost. In fact, by some calculations, when we looked at about 15 economies, 133 million new jobs to be created and 75 million lost. At the same time, though, that is a massive transition that most economies will need to go through, and in particular, a massive skills-related transition. So let me turn it over to Laura Tyson first to give us a little bit of a picture about what the labor market may look like, where future jobs will come from, and what are some of the areas where we will see reductions in terms of jobs.
All right. It's a big agenda in a couple of minutes. First of all, I want to start with the view that there are many, many studies of the effects of changing technology on the future of work, and they basically come to the same conclusion that Saadia mentioned in her surveys. These studies all come to the conclusion that there will be enough jobs, there will not be technological unemployment. The jobs will look different in many respects, that there will be significant disruption along the way. There will be sectors that decline and new sectors that arise. There will be a whole bunch of change in occupations, so that occupations we can't even name right now will come to exist, but a lot of occupations we now can name will disappear. Those kinds of dislocations and disruptions can take a long time. We're not talking about 2 years or 3 years, we're talking about decades. And I want to say that the cost to the individual, to the community, to the firm, to the society, there are big costs involved in these disruptions. And therefore, one of the challenges to society is to figure out how to share those costs. As far as jobs of the future are concerned, if you can be positive about the number, but I do think we all have to worry about the quality of the jobs, a good job. Because one of the things we know from technology so far is it's been polarizing in the job market. It has taken out many middle skill, middle income occupations. It has created new high skill, high income occupations, but a lot of people who had the middle skills have not been able to get those jobs and have slipped into the lower income jobs. So we have to worry about polarization. We have to worry about the declining middle income jobs. What is going to be a middle income job? If we are not going to have think about this from a developing society's point of view. If we're not going to have the same phase of industrialization that brought the U.S. through, that brought China through, massive industrialization, if that's not going to occur because the industrialization can be done largely by machines, what jobs are there? So I think we have to think about the quality of jobs, and then to think about just where might future demand come from. One way to think about the jobs of the future is say, well, what are people going to want? What are they going to want? So demographics suggest that there's a lot of wants that are going to be demographically determined. The want for education, the want for childcare, the want for health, the want for elderly care. A lot of these jobs exist right now. They're not very good jobs. They're not very good jobs. Sometimes they're entirely unpaid jobs. There are jobs in the home done by women, mostly, who are not paid to do those jobs. So basically, if demand is going to come in those areas, what is going to be the quality of the job? Are they going to have benefits? Are they going to have legal protections? What are we going to do with a domestic worker who is going to be a job of the future without the protections? The UN, by the way, has been working on this. Let me just say a couple other things about the jobs of the future. IT, it seems like there'll be a lot of jobs in the IT and the technology sector. Then we have to think about diversity in that sector, because if you look at the workforce in that sector around the world, you will see that it's not highly diverse. It is not highly diverse. There certainly is not, it lacks gender diversity at the very least. So if we think about that as a growth sector, there are issues of inclusion and diversity as well. So bottom line here is no technological unemployment, lots of disruption. The disruption will cause challenges to society. I'm concerned about the quality of the jobs, the polarization, what are the middle income jobs, and I'm concerned that the high-end jobs will continue to suffer from barriers to diversity and inclusion that we must work on.
Thank you, Laura. Minister Oreshkin, does that resonate? What's the picture in the Russian economy?
Well, good day to everyone. So, you know that there is a lot of talks these days about the technological disruption to the labor market. But if we look on the global picture, you know, for me as an economist, I like to look at the figures, on the statistics. You know, on the labor market, there are two main indicators. It's productivity and structural unemployment. What we're witnessing globally, especially in the past decade, the fact is that productivity is slowing down, and structural unemployment is also in decline. It means that the pace of technological disruption to the labor market is slowing down, actually, and not accelerating. So, of course, there are risks, there are shifts that will be happening to the labor market, but in my opinion, the pace of that transition, as of now, is very slow. So we need to speed up before we will be facing the problems. So once again, the hard figures in almost all major economies shows that this transition is happening very slow. That's the first point. The second point is that, of course, situation differs from country to country. If you look on countries like Russia or China, where the labor force is in decline, for those countries, of course, that technological transition is the only way to go forward, is the only way to keep economy growing. Because without that transition on the labor market, it will mean that the growth will stall, and there will be no development in the countries like Russia or China. Of course, there are other stories. For example, yesterday I was in Uzbekistan, a country with the population of just over 30 million of people, but with 600,000 new births every year. So a huge wave of new young labor force, new young people joining the labor force. So depending on what kind of demography situation we witness in different countries, so in terms of economic policy, the government policy, it should be different. In Russia and China, more emphasis should be made on reskilling and transforming industries and transforming jobs which are already in place. In countries like Uzbekistan or Africa, for example, with strong population growth, there is, the emphasis should be made on training that young generation, investing in education, primary education, in order to get that young generation ready for a new economy. So depending on the demography structure, you should have different approaches to key policy actions on the government side.
Thank you. Let me shift now from the macro to the micro. Sarah, what is the business case within your company for the focus on reskilling and upskilling? And also, when we look beyond one company and we know that we're going to need to do some major migration of people from one company to another, from one industry to another, how do we do that kind of redeployment at scale?
Thank you, Saadia. Good afternoon, everyone. In terms of turning to the business case first, I think more and more, if one is talking to kind of senior executives or line managers further down the organization, whether we're referring to Zurich or more broadly, there's an understanding and a realization that those hot skills that we're trying to solve for externally, there is just that scarcity. The labor market is tightening quite significantly. One reads the reports on that every day, and it's becoming an increasing issue for us. So the only way in which one can address that is really thinking about one's internal workforce and how do we kind of reskill, retool that workforce at pace for as much as we know are the kind of future state skills that we require. And that needs, in many instances, quite a kind of cultural shift, a mindset shift in terms of how we do things. And certainly at Zurich, you know, these are the things that we're really starting to focus on by way of how can one create the excitement, lessen the anxiety around this change. I think for me personally, I feel incredibly passionate around the fact that this isn't something that people should see as necessarily negative, but in terms of an opportunity for them to really think about their careers, so to speak. And I guess then that dovetails into the next question that you asked, Saadia, around the kind of broader longevity of one's career. I mean, I've been in HR now for some years, and I think when one's thinking about redeployment, one thinks about the kind of more traditional means of redeploying people where they can't be retained within one's organization. And I think now is the time, and we've been having conversations with Saadia and broader kind of members of the WEF around how do we create the alliance with those broader ecosystems to really think about where we can't retain 100% of our workforce, how can we align ourselves with that broader kind of ecosystem, so to speak, to understand what opportunities are available for people outside of institutions that they currently work within, and actually equipping them and retooling them to make that transition, which really for me is all important. And that's when it really, for me, becomes that broader societal problem and challenge that we're trying to address.
Thank you. And that brings us, I think, to this aspect of public-private collaboration. How do we, within one geography, mobilize multiple industries? How do we take a whole-of-government approach to this issue? And Minister Falasi, we've had the great pleasure of working with you on the Closing the Skills Gap Accelerator model. So both from that perspective and the developments that have been happening here, please.
So I think from my perspective, one of the biggest challenges faced on this specific topic is who takes the ownership. Is it the employee? Is it the academic sector? Is it the government? And so forth. So I think the accelerator addresses that by bringing on the table people from private sector, from public sector, and from academia to try and solve that. The second, I think, challenge is setting the value proposition specifically to private sector. Because at one hand, you can easily hire a readily available skilled person to replace whoever you have. And that problem is even more amplified in the UAE, where you have over 80% of your workers coming in internationally. So a company would argue and say, it's not even a socioeconomic issue because they're not citizens. I can always end a contract and bring somebody in. Now that has changed for two reasons. One is that we've seen increasingly workers who see the UAE as home and they would like to stay longer and live here. And that has also created to this nationalistic movement between residents and citizens. And secondly, companies are also realizing that is actually from a pure cost perspective, it's cheaper to retrain your own employees than to hire the next readily available employee, let alone company values and culture, but purely from economical perspective. And we've seen that in a number of organizations. We've seen that, for example, in pure private like Majid Al Fatim, who are also co-chairing with us. They've put significant investments in retooling and retraining their own employees, as opposed to sourcing the best talent. And the third point is, I think, about future-proofing versus having people readily available. I think no matter what we do, and I'm talking with my educational hat, it's almost impossible for higher education to have employees that are ready for every single job. The hard skills, as the way I would say, are changing. Today it might be, 3D printing, it could be quantum mechanics, could be something else. But I think our main challenge is developing lifelong learners that have the right soft skills, which are, by the way, not as soft and the most difficult skills to develop, who would be able to not only be ready for a job today, that's our responsibility, but also to be able to proactively retrain themselves and retool themselves. And I think, to summarize, the accelerator addresses these three main areas. One is to infuse a culture of lifelong learning. Two is to sell the value proposition of retooling and reskilling, especially in an international labor market like ours. And thirdly, in terms of ownership, who does what and how can we work together?
Thank you. We will have time for a few questions, but let me perhaps pose another one to the panel first. We're releasing, I think, later today or tomorrow, a paper on shaping economic policy in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and we're focused in particular on innovation policy, labor policy, and fiscal policy. And this is the work of the Council on the New Economic Agenda. And what it finds is that these three things are going to have to change together, essentially. As our economies need to become more diversified, as they need to become more sustainable, as they need to become more inclusive, there are a whole new set of tasks that have to be done, not just the ownership, but also who pays for them and how we make that shift. So are there views from the panel? We have the pleasure of having two policymakers, a renowned academic, and Sarah, you pointed out that there are certain things the company can do, and there are other areas in which policy really has to change. So are there views on, as we look outward at the next 5 years and look at the diversification of various economies, both advanced and emerging, what are the specific policy changes that you would want to see happening to ensure that people are able to make the shift towards the future of jobs?
Maybe I will start with. So there are definitely a macroeconomic part of the story and a microeconomic part of the story. First of all, in order for people to have jobs, we need to have enough level of aggregate demand in the economy. And that is what is missing these days. So in this question on how the monetary and fiscal policy will be working in the tomorrow's world, because what we're witnessing this day, that they're not coping with bringing aggregate demand in major economies. The number one, of course, example is the European Union, with the single currency and no single fiscal policy, and inability for this fiscal and monetary to coordinate to get the proper level of aggregate demand. Because, the number one story always, you need to have a proper level of aggregate demand in order to get a proper level of employment. And of course, on a micro level, the shifts that are happening is that the length of life is increasing. So it means that was totally addressed by the minister, that you need to change throughout your whole life in order to be able to be present in a proper way on the labor market. And other stories that were already mentioned on micro level, we also should tweak the policies on how we educate, what we educate, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Would anyone else in the panel like to add something?
So I'll just add a couple of things. Certainly, I agree. We should always start these discussions by saying, if you're in a bad economic cycle, if you have insufficient aggregate demand, there's going to be unemployment. And so basically, that's a given, and I agree. We should all start that way. Just some additional things, because I think everything you said I agree with. The growth of non-standard work. So this is a big issue in the OECD. It's actually in developing countries, it's often called the gray economy, the informal economy. There are lots of people working without legal protections and without any benefits, without any acquisition of social protections. So The OECD countries are now all looking at, well, what do you do about that? So, for example, even in my own state of California, we just passed regulation. And the regulation basically says it's basically going to go to court, but it's a law, which basically says if you're working for many employers on a platform, like you're an Uber driver and a Lyft driver and a DoorDash driver, you're all of those things, you have no regular employer, you have no legal protections, you have no social benefits. So basically now the law is going to say, no, you're an employee. The UK has done some of that now. So basically you say, okay, this is a different kind of category of employee. It's not standard, but we're going to provide the kinds of protections that we provide to a standard employment contract because more and more people are going to have these in non-standard forms. So I think that's a really important area. Minimum wages. I really think this is really important because what you might have is this is something Germany has introduced. Germany introduced a minimum wage in 2015 because what they saw happening was with a number of reforms and the productivity and the competitiveness of the German economy, the bottom 10% of jobs, the wage was just collapsing. It was falling to standards that the society was not comfortable with. So they put in a minimum wage, and the minimum wage is tied to the median wage. And the minimum wage over time will capture a large number of the workers in these service areas that are always going to be important regardless of what kind of future of work we imagine. So I'll do that. And then finally, I just want to, we talk a lot about collaboration here all the time. And mostly what's missing in the collaboration, not all the time, I'm oftentimes in rooms, but is the voice of labor. Okay, the voice of labor. So I'm sitting in Germany. And in Germany, every enterprise of 5 or more has a works council by law. And the works council has a right to comment on the organizational structure that is going to be driven by the technology, has a right to comment on the kind of training that should be done at the apprenticeship level to bring in workers to fit the new technology. So a worker's voice here, it seems to me, through works councils, different governance structures, more effective union structure is very, very important. In Germany, and I've learned this, they will say that they call together the Employers Association, the Workers Association, and the government to think through what is this sector's employment and production likely to look like during the next decade, and then try to think about what policies or skills or apprenticeship programs they need. So it's a voice of the 3 major actors, the government, labor, and the employers.
If I can just add on what was just touched, because it's a very important thing. We should not allow technological shift to mask just a redistribution from a worker to a company, because that will be a problem. If the technological shift is used only for redistribution and not achieving higher productivity and proper, income and wealth distribution, then it might result as a problem.
Great, thank you. 2 very important perspectives on these new frontiers of policymaking. I want to give at least the chance for the audience to ask us one question. I think we have just a couple of minutes, so one question. Okay, then I have another question for the group. The Global Future Council Summit, of course, where we are here today, we're talking about mapping out systems, we're talking about mapping out stakeholders in different systems, we're talking about the pathways to the vision that we want for 2030. But I do want to bring this back to a personal level. And that's the final question for each of you. If you had to advise a young person today on what they should be thinking about in terms of the skills they need to acquire so that they have the opportunity to fulfill their potential in the labor market, what would you advise them? And Minister, let me turn to you first, because this economy is doing wonders in that front.
Thank you. It's a really tough one. I think if I were to summarize everything in terms of lifelong learning, I would advise young people to try as much as they can to remain curious, right? Do not confine yourself to a specific field, because curiosity, from my perspective, is the root cause for continuous learning. The moment you become less curious, you're not going to continue pursuing training yourself. So I think curiosity is a very important one. And 2, not to look at skilling and reskilling as a reactive threat, but more as a proactive. So how would I imagine myself, I'm an engineer, in 10 years' time, or computer science? So I think there's a big shift to the positive side as opposed to scaring people. And that happens on the labor, because that affects your employment and your immediate income. But on the younger generation, make it a bit more positive, talk about the opportunities. The study you had was very impressive about net there are more jobs being created. So we need to paint a better picture and link that up with the basic appreciation for curiosity. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah, let me come to you next.
Yeah, that really resonates for me, and I'm not just saying this, but I would have definitely brought in the kind of piece around curiosity in that, and we talked about it in our breakout session, it's about getting individuals to really think about the personal effectiveness side of learning in terms of the mindsets, the curiosity, the passion for learning in a very different way. And I think it's incumbent upon us all, to your great points around looking at reskilling and upskilling very differently, such that people see it as a continuous advancement of how they will learn professionally and personally. And I think certainly, organizations, whether it be education or indeed industry, can do a lot more to try and get this right and instill that level of excitement and eagerness into our younger workforce, as opposed to them seeing it as something they have to do in order to remain current. So for me, it's quite a mindset shift.
Laura, perhaps you next, and then I'll come to you, Minister.
So I don't know. I'm a little concerned when I think about the so I've been in university for most of my life, and when I think about the students who are coming to university, and I think about many of them come from community colleges, and many of them are first generation at a place like the University of California, Berkeley, which is a public institution. So we're very proud of the fact that there are many first generation. I think we would be hard pressed if we just said to these students, you need to be curious and creative. First of all, I think it would fall on deaf ears. I think that their families and themselves who struggle to get them there want some direction in terms of skills that are likely to be important for their future income. I just think that's reality, okay? So I remember when in my own family, I mean, my choosing economics was that made my father very happy. He was a first generation college goer. He was not happy that my sister chose history. So basically, I just want to start with that. I think universities have the responsibility, therefore, to think very hard about changing their curriculum to give people some of the skills that they will almost certainly need regardless of their future job trajectory. And universities are thinking hard about this right now, but they're just beginning. There have not been major revolutionary changes in basic university curriculum. So I would say that. Finally, I would say that I think companies can do a lot here. Companies, if you take the notion that we're trying to say what should skill, so I'm on the board of a very big company. The very big company would say, over the next 10 years, I know the number of my employees is going to decline dramatically because of robots and because of software. I know that's going to happen. I also know what kinds of skills are going to be required for the people who stay or the people who come in new. And so they have provided with Coursera and Udacity and others a whole sort of set of curriculum. If you're interested in this sector, and then these are the things you should be taking. The companies can take a lot of ownership of this. And of course, in the apprenticeship system in Germany, they do, and in the Swiss system of apprenticeships, they do. So I would say I'd look to the educators and say, okay, let's help tell these students of the future, these are some essential things that you need if you want to move in this direction.
Great. Thank you, Laura. And Minister, you have the last word.
Yeah, besides curiosity and learning skill, what is very important, I believe, is, of course, critical thinking and ability to challenge information that is available. Because you know that the volumes of information is increasing, social networks, media, internet, a lot of sources. So ability to look and question that information, ability to get to the roots is very important these days, and it will be becoming even more important going forward.
That's great. Thank you very much. Please join me in giving the panel a round of applause. Thank you very much. I think from everything we've heard, the future of jobs can look very bright and very positive for our populations, provided we put in place the changes within business, the changes within the public sector, and the collaboration between the public and the private sector. Thank you very much.